These people are my guests, so you don't belong here. That's what she screamed at this entitled woman named Karina when I came face to face with a crowd of strangers scattered across the lakeside property I had inherited. Tents were everywhere, families lounging as if they were on some kind of resort getaway, using my land like it was their own personal vacation spot. When I calmly tried to ask what was going on, she erupted. Furious, and to my disbelief, she called the police on me, the rightful owner of the property. Her arrogance was staggering. She was so sure of her control, so blindly confident, that when her entire operation began to fall apart, she made one fatal error. And the best part? I didn't even have to set the trap. She stepped into it on her own. Hey Drama Nest family, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Coming back home was never supposed to hurt this much. After months of grinding away at my software engineering job in the city, I craved one thing: peace, the kind only my childhood lake house could give me. But this wasn't just any house. This place was a memory carved in time. My parents had built their dreams on this land. My mother spent hours in her lakeside flower garden, and our summers were filled with family barbecues and laughter that drifted into the night. When they passed 3 years ago, I couldn't bring myself to sell it. I settled for a tiny apartment in the city, promising myself I'd return when I was finally ready to face the memories. And that moment had finally come on a warm June Friday afternoon. I took a week off, loaded the car with tools and supplies, and made the 2-hour drive from downtown, expecting a calm, quiet haven. What I found instead made my heart stop. Before I even reached the front door, I could hear the music, shouting, laughter, all of it crashing through the natural serenity I remembered so well. My hands clenched the steering wheel as I turned down the familiar gravel drive toward the lake. And then I saw it. The sight will haunt me. My mother's flower garden. 15 years of her love and patience was gone, torn up. Mud and tire marks where roses and hydrangeas once bloomed. Bits of her hand-painted wooden chairs were scattered across the dirt like trash. I stopped, stepped out, and picked up a shattered piece of one of the legs. My eyes blurred as I whispered, "I'm home, Mom." But someone's taken what's ours. The grief in that moment was crushing. But what lay beyond the garden was even worse. My once pristine lakefront had been overrun. Dozens of tents pitched like a chaotic festival site, some barely standing, some too close to the shoreline. RVs blocked the lawn, their generators drowning out any trace of nature's quiet song. Garbage spilled out of bags near makeshift fire pits, and the air was heavy with the stench of beer and sweat. I was frozen, trying to comprehend what I was seeing, when a woman emerged from the center of it all. Mid-50s, styled gray hair, wearing a crisp white polo that read "HOA President." She moved like she owned everything in sight, clutching a small wooden cash box. I watched her approach a young couple stepping out of their tent. "That's $30 for tonight," she said matter-of-factly. "Cash only. Quiet hours start at 10. We're a family-friendly community." They handed over the money without a word. The woman, who I would later learn was named Miranda Walsh, tucked the bills into her box like she'd done it 1,000 times. Then someone shouted from another tent, "Hey Miranda, is it true this used to be private land?" She waved him off with a smirk. "That's ancient history. The HOA turned it into a recreation area. Some folks still think they own parts of it, but they're holding on to old paperwork. I manage this land now for the good of the whole community." I felt a fire ignite in my chest. But I didn't confront her. Not yet. Maybe I was still too shocked. Or maybe the logical part of my brain kicked in. If Miranda had twisted this situation so thoroughly, going in guns blazing would only make me look like the problem. Instead, I got back in my car, and I started collecting evidence. I noted license plates, filmed her taking money, documented everything. This woman was clearly running an illegal camping business on my land. As the sun dipped behind the lake I grew up swimming in. I sat in silence, watching her rake in hundreds of dollars from unsuspecting campers. She was using my family's property to bankroll her lifestyle. And yet a broken bar. It wasn't just about the money. There was something about the way she moved, the confidence, the way she dismissed legal ownership like it was a joke. This was about control, about power. That night, I drove back to the city with a broken piece of my mother's chair resting on the seat beside me. My mind spun with questions. Who was Miranda Walsh, really? How had she fooled an entire community into believing they had a right to be there? How long had this scam been running? How much money had she pocketed? And how could I, just one heartbroken software engineer with a deed in my glove box, possibly take down someone who thrived on exploiting legal loopholes and false authority? But as traffic crawled on that city highway, I looked down at that splintered chair leg and something changed inside me. The shock I'd felt the day before had faded. In its place was something sharper, quiet, focused resolve. Miranda Walsh had chosen the wrong property to hijack and the wrong person to underestimate. I didn't need to raise my voice or play into her narrative. All I had to do was wait, watch, and let her arrogance stig her own downfall. Sure, she had legal experience and years of practice exploiting her position, but I had something just as valuable: patience, logic, and the determination of a software engineer with nothing left to lose. Type karma if you think Ethan will get his revenge. Type hopeless if you think Miranda will come out on top. The next morning, I called in sick to work and drove back to the Lakea, this time with a strategy. I wasn't going to storm and demanding answers. That's exactly the move she'd anticipate, and exactly how she'd spin the story in her favor. Instead, I was going to do what I did best: collect information, identify the patterns, and build a case she couldn't escape from. Armed with my drone, laptop, and a cooler full of snacks, I parked on a hill overlooking the property ready for surveillance. From above, the drone revealed the full extent of the destruction. Deep tire marks scored the earth. Trash was strewn across what used to be a flawless lawn. Even more concerning, there were unmistakable signs of improper waste disposal, violations that would no doubt interest environmental authorities. But the most damning footage came at 9 a.m. sharp. Miranda showed up, just like clockwork, strutting through the campsite with her cash box in hand like she was the landlady. I recorded everything, every payment, every command, every moment where she paraded around as if she were the legitimate manager of this stolen campground. Around 10, I decided to start talking to the neighbors to see what information I could dig up. I approached the home next door, where a kind-looking elderly couple were tending their vibrant garden. Their carefully kept yard made the chaos on my property look even worse. When I introduced myself as the actual owner of the lake house, the look they exchanged told me I was on to something. "Oh dear," the woman said, casting a nervous glance toward the campsite. "You better tread carefully. Mrs. Walsh fined someone $200 last year just for putting their flag out one day too early. She's difficult, especially if she thinks you're challenging her." Her husband, Thomas Rodriguez, nodded grimly. "We've been wondering when the real owner would show up. She's been parading around here for months, saying the HOA took over that land, but the paperwork she's flashed around, suspicious at best. The moment anyone asks for specifics, she shuts them down." His wife, Susan, added, "Just yesterday a young man moved in next door, a college student, Dylan Pierce. Nice boy." He seemed really confused when Miranda told him this was official HOA camping land. He kept asking for proof. That was exactly what I needed to hear. If people were already starting to question her authority, then my reappearance would only make things more complicated for her. But I had to be careful with my next move. So, I took a small, calculated step. I pitched a single tent on the far edge of my own land, far enough to avoid interfering directly with her campsite scam, but visible enough to make a point. Someone else was here now, and they weren't going away. I didn't have to wait long for the reaction. Within an hour, I heard sirens. Miranda had called the police on me for camping on my own property. The irony was staggering. 2 officers approached, clearly expecting to deal with a typical trespasser. "Sir, we've received a report of unauthorized camping," one of them said. "Do you have permission to be here?" This was the moment I'd been preparing for. I calmly handed them my deed, current property tax records, and ID. Right on cue, Miranda came storming over, radiating self-righteous fury. "Officers, this is what I've been talking about," she snapped. "People thinking they can just show up and set up camp wherever they please. I had documentation proving this land is under home management. He's clearly trespassing." She looked so certain, so smug as if her usual scare tactics would work on the police just as easily as they worked on the clueless campers. But then, something shifted. The lead officer reviewed my documents, his expression turning more and more puzzled. He looked back at Miranda with a new tone in his voice. "Ma'am, this man has a valid deed showing he owns this entire property. His tax records are up to date. As far as we can tell, he has every legal right to be here." The second officer glanced at the campsite, clearly taking in the mess. "Wait a second, are you saying you've been managing campground operations on someone else's private land?" Miranda's face went pale, then pink, then bright, furious red. That's outdated paperwork," she stammered. "The situation has changed. The HOA has assumed responsibility for this land for the community's benefit," Miranda insisted. But her voice, once so commanding, now cracked under pressure. It wasn't confidence anymore, it was desperation. The officers exchanged a look I'd seen before, the kind that said they dealt with self-appointed tyrants trying to pass off personal power grabs as official protocol. It rarely ended well for the person clinging to false authority. "Ma'am," the lead officer said, "an HOA doesn't override private property rights. If this man holds the deed, then he's within his full legal rights to be here. In fact, we need to talk about what's happening with the other campers." He gestured toward the sprawl of tents, RVs, and trash a makeshift commercial campground. Then came the question that cracked the whole thing wide open. "Are you charging people to camp on land you don't own?" Silence. Thick, damning silence. Miranda's mouth opened, then closed again. For the first time in what I imagined were decades, she had no answer, no clever retort, no obscure legal jargon to obscure the facts. She looked like a puppet that had suddenly lost its strings. And the facts were brutal. She'd been running an illegal operation on land that didn't belong to her, and she'd just tried to have the actual owner arrested. The officers took down my information and assured me they'd follow up on the camping violations. As they returned to their vehicle, I caught part of a radio exchange requesting code enforcement to assess potential environmental damage. Miranda remained frozen in place, watching her empire unravel. All around us, campers were quietly packing their things, realizing they'd unknowingly been drawn into something far beyond a lakeside weekend. But I knew better than to celebrate too early. This wasn't over. This was only the beginning. Miranda Walsh had built her power on projection, claiming control, exerting pressure, and using intimidation to silence dissent, being publicly challenged and corrected by police officers. That was likely the most humiliating moment of her entire reign. And people like Miranda don't just walk away. They retaliate, they escalate, they get sloppy. For the first time in her life, she'd been forced to stand still and shut up. But I knew it wouldn't last. A woman like her who had lived by bending rules and distorting truth wasn't going to let someone like me win without a fight. What do you think Miranda will do next? Drop your predictions in the comments. If I thought the police encounter would scare her off, I was sorely mistaken. The next 3 days were the start of what can only be described as psychological warfare. It began with formal notices printed on whole letterhead, delivered directly to the temporary mailbox I'd listed on official records. Each letter accused me of violating various community standards: excessive noise during quiet hours, despite me sitting silently in my tent every night; environmental contamination, even though her campers had left behind more filth in 3 days than I could in 3 months; and unauthorized modifications to community property, apparently referring to my single tent pitched on my own land. But Miranda didn't stop there. Somehow, she'd uncovered where I worked. That's when the phone calls started. Carefully worded, polite in tone, but unmistakably malicious in intent. She'd contacted my boss directly, posing as a concerned community member, warning about my disruptive behavior and refusal to respect shared governance. No accusations specific enough to be disproven, just the kind of subtle poison that plants doubt in someone's mind. It was calculated, precise, classic manipulation from someone who understood how to twist social perception into a weapon. And while she tried to crush me from the outside, I was digging into her past. What I found explained everything. Miranda Walsh had been a lawyer on SEO, but her career had ended in scandal. She'd been caught billing clients for services she never performed and mismanaging estate funds, 5 years ago, her law license had been revoked. The bar issued a formal statement urging her to seek therapy for what they called ethical deficiencies and a persistent pattern of deception. Her entire self-worth had been built on the idea that she was the smartest one in the room, the person with knowledge, leverage, and control. When she lost her law license, the only authority she had left was through the HOA, and she'd weaponized that title to rebuild the illusion of power. Charging people to camp on my land wasn't just about money, it was about status, control, proving to the community and probably to herself that she was still someone important. Someone who could run something complex and make it look legitimate. Every dollar she pocketed, every camper she ordered around, was her way of reclaiming relevance. And now that I'd exposed the lie, she wasn't going to let that go quietly. Miranda's obsession wasn't just with control, it was with validation. She needed people to believe in her authority, to need her leadership. And once I understood that, I knew exactly how to bait the trap. That evening, I sat down and composed a carefully worded post for the community bulletin board. It didn't accuse Miranda of anything directly. Instead, it calmly announced that, due to serious infrastructure concerns, the lakefront camping area would need to close temporarily for safety inspections. I even added a specific estimate of potential revenue loss of roughly $2,000 per month and politely suggested that someone with the proper authority and expertise might be able to expedite a resolution. It was bait, pure and simple, every line crafted to tug at Miranda's most volatile insecurities. The mention of lost revenue, that would trigger her greed; the call for appropriate authority, that would challenge her self-image; and the tone of deferential, almost pleading, would make her feel like the solution to a problem that only she could fix. Sure enough, within hours, Miranda removed the post and replaced it with her own bold proclamation. She dismissed my concerns as uninformed and assured residents that camping would continue without interruption under her personal supervision. It was exactly the reaction I'd hoped for, but more importantly, the mask was slipping. Her language had changed. It was sharper, more defensive. She was making increasingly grandiose claims about her authority, a classic signs of someone trying to shore up a crumbling foundation with sheer force of will. Meanwhile, I had a quiet, revealing conversation with Dylan Pierce, a college student who'd been mentioned by neighbors. He approached me casually and asked, "Mrs. Walsh told us this is an official HOA camping area. Are you a member too?" I smiled. "Actually, I own the land." His eyes widened in visible relief. Thank God. Something felt really off. I asked her for documents about the HOA's control over this property and she got a broken bar, weirdly defensive. I'm honestly thinking about camping somewhere else next weekend. That one comment lit the fuse. Dylan was naturally curious, polite, and skeptical, exactly the kind of person who asked the right questions and wouldn't accept vague answers. And best of all, I didn't need to manipulate him. I just needed to let Miranda's need for control clash with someone who wouldn't play along. The trap was now fully set. She had taken the bait, loudly declaring her authority over land she didn't own, while continuing to escalate her attacks against me professionally and personally. From the outside, it might have looked like I was losing ground. But all I'd done was cast the line, and the fish was already thrashing. Now it was just a matter of time. Was the plan foolproof, or had I underestimated Miranda Walsh, former lawyer and expert manipulator? Type genius if you believe the trap is perfect, type busted if you think she'll sniff it out. What happened next played out so perfectly according to her own psychology that I almost felt guilty about how easy it was. Dylan decided, of his own volition, to verify Miranda's authority one final time before abandoning the lake entirely. I hadn't nudged him. I hadn't even followed up. He was simply a thoughtful young man who wanted to make sure the person taking his money had the legal right to do so. Sometimes, the universe hands you the exact catalyst you need and no scheming required. Saturday arrived crisp and clear, the kind of day that made lakeside property look like paradise. I positioned myself with a clear view of the campsite, officially there to assess needed repairs, but in truth, waiting for the moment I knew was coming. The night before, I'd set up a discreet camera system, Not hidden, just subtle. A pair of weatherproof devices that would quietly record whatever happened next. I had no idea I was about to capture a moment that would turn a local dispute into something much bigger. Dylan returned to the same spot he'd camped the weekend before, but this time, he was prepared. When Miranda approached with her usual clipboard and cash box, she was met not with deference, but with calm, polite skepticism. "Good morning, Mrs. Walsh," he said, his voice steady. "Before I pay, could you show me the HOA documentation that grants authority over this specific property?" I checked the county records, and they show individual ownership and not community management. The look on Miranda's face, it was like a crack splitting through porcelain. The shift in Miranda's demeanor was immediate and unmistakable. The charming, confident figure she usually presented to the public vanished in an instant. What replaced it was raw, unfiltered fury, the kind that explodes when someone used to absolute control feels cornered by someone they consider beneath them. "You checked county records?" she snapped, eyes narrowing. "Who do you think you are, questioning my authority?" "I've been managing this community longer than you've been alive. I don't need to justify my decisions to some college kid who doesn't even understand how real estate works." But Dylan didn't flinch. Calm, steady, and polite, he stood his ground. "Ma'am, I'm just asking for the kind of documentation any legitimate operation would provide. If this is home-managed land, there should be clear paperwork to show that. I'm not trying to cause a problema, I just want to make sure everything's above board before I hand over money." And that was when Miranda made the fatal mistake that would unravel everything. Instead of de-escalating or offering even a flimsy excuse, she let rage override reason. Her need to dominate the situation at HOA took over. Unfortunately for her, she'd chosen the worst possible moment. Tony Rivera, the HOA's maintenance supervisor, had just arrived. Miranda had told him it was just a routine campground issue, but now she found herself performing in front of a witness she couldn't control. And Tony was no fool, he could tell things had escalated beyond anything he'd signed up for. Miranda's voice climbed to a shrill pitch. "Legal? I've been running this site for months without a single complaint. I collect thousands in fees. I handle every part of this campground and I don't need permission from anyone to do my job." She threw her arms in the air, shouting louder now. "You want documentation? Here's your documentation. I'm the president of this HOA, and what I say goes." She was practically shaking, gesturing wildly, the last threads of her composure fraying. Tony stood frozen nearby, clearly uncomfortable and starting to grasp the gravity of what he'd stepped into. "Mrs. Walsh," he said quietly, "I thought I was here to help with basic maintenance. I'm not trained to handle legal dispute as a broken bar or this kind of confrontation." But Miranda wasn't listening. Dylan, still remarkably composed, tried once more. "I understand you feel strongly about this," he said evenly, "but I really do need to see some kind of documentation before I pay. It's nothing personal, I just don't want to be involved in anything a broken bar illegal." That last word, illegal, was the trigger. Something snapped. "Illegal?" Miranda shrieked, her face going scarlet. "You little punk. Nobody accuses me of anything illegal. I run this place. I make the rules. And if you don't like it, to get the hell off my property." Then, in front of 20 stunned campers, in front of Tony, and in front of me, she shoved Dylan hard. He stumbled back, lost his footing, and fell into the muddy shoreline. For a moment, everything was still. No one spoke. The entire campground seemed to hold its breath, stunned by what had just happened. Miranda Walsh, HOA president, self-declared authority, self-righteous enforcer, had just physically assaulted a young camper for daring to ask for legal proof. And she'd done it in broad daylight, in front of multiple witnesses, on property that wasn't even hers. I stepped forward, phone in hand, screen glowing, clearly recording. "Mrs. Walsh," I said, my voice calm, "you just assaulted Dylan because he asked to see documentation. I already called the police when I heard you yelling." That moment is burned into my memory. She didn't argue, she didn't deny, she didn't even move. She froze literally, her body locked in place, her hands still mid-motion from the shove, her mouth slightly open, her eyes wide with the slow, dawning horror of what she'd just done. For the first time in as long as anyone could remember, Miranda Walsh had nothing to say. Tony slowly backed away, clearly trying to distance himself from the unfolding disaster. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I was never trained for anything like this. I'm going to have to file a report. There's no way I can ignore this." You could see the realization hit her in stages. This wasn't just a PR problem. It wasn't a community squabble she could spin. This was an assault. It was a crime. And Tanya and HOA employee had seen everything. Then came the sound that sealed it all. Sirens in the distance, growing louder. She had crossed the line. What began as a petty power play had now escalated into criminal territory. Miranda had tried to tighten her grip on authority and in doing so, crushed her entire fight till the Section 8. In under 5 minutes, she'd gone from local tyrant to potential defendant. And Dylan? He was already standing, brushing off the mud, dignity intact. Dylan stood up from the mud, clearly rattled but not physically harmed. "I just wanted to see some paperwork," he said softly, and somehow, that quiet sentence cut deeper than any accusation ever could. Here was a polite, reasonable young man assaulted for asking the most basic and legitimate of questions. As the flashing lights of police cruisers came into view, it hit me. Miranda Walsh had done what no amount of protest or evidence ever could. She had exposed herself completely. Not just her fraudulent operation, but her unfiltered, tyrannical nature laid bare in public for everyone to witness. This wasn't a trap I'd set. It was one she had spent years building, brick by brick, with arrogance, entitlement, and unchecked power. In a matter of minutes, she had crossed the threshold from fraudulent queen to a violent offender caught red-handed in front of witnesses. But would it be enough to dismantle the career and influence she'd constructed? That question was still hanging in the air. Let BD Stories know in the comments what you think Miranda will face next, because this was only the beginning of her downfall. The next 20 minutes unfolded like a case study in how quickly a house of lies can collapse when faced with undeniable truth. The responding officers were familiar, the same ones who had been summoned by Miranda just days earlier when she'd falsely reported me for trespassing. Their faces said it all. They remembered exactly who she was and what she'd tried to pull. And now, the roles were reversed. Dylan, muddy and composed, stood in sharp contrast to Miranda, who looked like she'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes, frozen in place, her authority visibly crumbling. "Ma'am," Officer Martinez said firmly, "we're responding to a report of an assault." "Are you Miranda Walsh?" His tone was dry, clinical, and nothing like the deferential Mrs. Walsh she was once accustomed to. She was no longer the respected authority. She was now a suspect. Everything about the officer's body language made clear they knew exactly what kind of situation they were dealing with. Dylan, despite being the victim, remained calm. When asked to recount what happened, he gave a precise, measured statement. "I asked Mrs. Walsh for documentation proving the HOA had the authority to charge camping fees on this property. She got angry and told me no one questions her authority. When I asked again, she shoved me and I fell." No drama, no exaggeration, just facts, which, under the circumstances, were damning enough. Meanwhile, Tony Rivera was giving his own statement to another officer, and his version of events only made things worse for Miranda. "I was told I was here for routine maintenance. I had no idea there were legal concerns." When the young man asked for documentation, Mrs. Walsh became agitated and aggressive. The shove was unprovoked. He never raised his voice or made any threatening moves, but the final nail came from the campers themselves. As it became obvious that Miranda was facing serious legal trouble, people who had previously kept their heads down began speaking up. One family said they'd been charged different amounts on different weekends with no explanation. Another shared how Miranda threatened to revoke their access to community facilities after they questioned an extra fee for lake access. It wasn't just a single incident anymore, it was a pattern of intimidation, manipulation, and abuse of assumed power. She had been operating a racket, hiding behind a false title and bullying people into compliance. Then the officer taking my statement asked something that made his eyebrows rise. "You're the actual property owner?" "Yes," I said. "I've been trying to shut down her illegal operation for days. She even called you to report me for trespassing on my own land." He blinked, then shook his head with a grim smirk. "So, let me get this straight. She falsely reported you for trespassing, and now she's assaulted someone for asking to verify her authority to run a business on your land?" The irony wasn't lost on anyone, and you could see the shift. This wasn't just about assault anymore. This was shaping into a broader case involving fraud, impersonation, and abuse of public services. Right then, Rachel White, the attorney I'd consulted the day before, arrived. I had called her as soon as things turned physical, knowing this situation had escalated beyond anything I could manage on my own. She took one look at the scene of police cars, a muddy victim, a stunned aggressor surrounded by witnesses, and her expression lit up. "That quiet confidence you see in lawyers when they know they're about to win, officers," Rachel said, handing over her credentials. "I represent the property owner. We have extensive video evidence of Mrs. Walsh's unauthorized camping operation, along with records indicating fraudulent activity and, as of today, assault. We'll be pursuing both criminal charges and civil action." The contrast between her poised professionalism and Miranda's unraveling demeanor couldn't have been more stark. And then came the most devastating moment yet, when Officer Martinez turned to Miranda and asked, "Ma'am, can you explain your authority to operate this campground?" She opened her mouth to answer, and nothing came out. When Officer Martinez asked Miranda to explain her authority to charge camping fees on private property, it was her moment, her chance to produce documentation, justify her actions, or at least attempt some sort of defense. But she said nothing. She stood there, opening and closing her mouth like someone watching their entire world collapse in real time. The same woman who had spent months lording over others with self-proclaimed legal expertise now couldn't manage a single coherent sentence in front of actual law enforcement. As she was led away in handcuffs, the atmosphere among the campers shifted dramatically. Instead of slinking away in embarrassment for having participated in something illegal, they rallied around Dylan and me. A middle-aged man stepped forward, shaking Dylan's hand. "Son, you did what the rest of us should have done a long time ago," he said. "That woman's been bullying this place for years." Took guts to stand up to her. It was the moment the floodgates opened. People began sharing stories, along suppressed frustrations now spilling into the open. Arbitrary fines, ever-changing rules, constant threats that made the neighborhood feel less like a community and more like a dictatorship. An elderly woman quietly admitted she hadn't hung laundry outside in months. Miranda had threatened her with a fine for visual pollution. A young father recounted being charged $50 after his child used sidewalk chalk. By the end of the day, word of Miranda's arrest had spread across the entire neighborhood, and for the first time, the community found its voice. The bulletin board overflowed with angry posts demanding her resignation and calling for immediate reform. But what struck me most was watching Dylan transform. The same college student who just wanted to see some paperwork was now being hailed as a local hero. People thanked him, over and over, for having the courage to say what so many had been too afraid to ask. Inadvertently, Dylan had become the face of a grassroots uprising, a community standing up to an authoritarian regime masquerading as whole leadership. Meanwhile, Tony Rivera diligently documented everything for his official report. I overheard him speaking to Officer Martinez. "I want to be very clear," he said. "Mrs. Walsh told me I was here for routine maintenance. I had no idea she was running a commercial operation, and I certainly wasn't prepared to witness her assault someone. This is way outside anything I've ever had to deal with." As the police cars finally drove off with Miranda in custody, I stood with Dylan, Rachel, and a group of neighbors on the very land I owned. The illegal camping operation was done. The environmental damage could be repaired, but most importantly, the person who had ruled through fear had finally been held accountable. Miranda Walsh wasn't just losing control, as she was now a criminal defendant. Her downfall was as dramatic as it was satisfying, but the question lingered: would a woman like Miranda, who had manipulated and intimidated her way into power, really go down quietly? Or would she try to take others with her? Type surrender if you believe Miranda will finally give up. Type revenge if you think she's not finished yet. The 24 hours following her arrest felt like watching a house of cards collapse in slow motion. Only with every card that fell, a new layer of corruption was revealed. What began as a simple assault charge quickly grew into a full-scale investigation of Miranda's entire tenure as HOA president. What investigators found was worse than anyone imagined. Rachel White wasted no time filing a sweeping civil lawsuit. It didn't just detail the illegal camping operation, it documented a years-long patterns of abuse. "We're not just seeking damages for trespassing," Rachel explained as we reviewed the complaint. "We're outlining a history of systematic fraud, intimidation, and financial misconduct." Mrs. Walsh treated this community like her personal business empire. As the investigation widened, so did the charges: assault and battery for attacking Dylan, fraud for the unlicensed camping operation, theft for collecting money on land she didn't own, intimidation for threatening anyone who questioned her. But the most damning revelation came when financial records were uncovered. Miranda had been funneling HOA funds into her illegal enterprise, effectively stealing from her neighbors to support her unauthorized campground. Meanwhile, Dylan's story gained traction outside our little neighborhood. News outlets picked it up. College student assaulted for asking to see paperwork. The narrative struck a chord, and Dylan handled the attention with the same steady composure he had shown all along. "I just wanted to see the documentation," he told a local reporter. "I never thought it would turn into this." And yet, it had turned into so much more. The idea that simply asking for basic legal documentation could provoke a violent attack was still hard to process. It made you wonder what else might someone like that be hiding if a simple question triggered such an extreme reaction. The community's response to Miranda's downfall was swift and decisive. An emergency home meeting was scheduled for the next evening, and the turnout was unlike anything we'd ever seen. People who had been too intimidated to attend meetings during Miranda's reign now showed up in droves, eager to reclaim their role in the governance of their own neighborhood. The meeting had to be relocated to the high school gymnasium to accommodate the crowd. Long silenced voices finally spoke. Thomas and Susan Rodriguez, my elderly neighbors, addressed the crowd with quiet emotion. "We stopped hosting family barbecues," Susan said, "because Mrs. Walsh warned us she'd issue fines if children played in the backyard past 7 p.m. She paused before adding, "We've been prisoners in our own community, afraid to live normal lives because someone with a title acted like she had absolute power over all of us." The most damning revelations came from former HOA board members who had resigned in protest of Miranda's authoritarian leadership. One described how she routinely scheduled meetings without proper notice and pushed major decisions through without a quorum. A former treasurer recalled, "When I asked about financial transparency, she told me board members were advisory only and that she had executive authority to handle funds as she pleased. I resigned because I was afraid I'd be held legally accountable for what she was doing." Then came the bombshell. Investigators revealed that Miranda had been collecting roughly $600 per weekend in camping fees during peak season, about $24,000 annually, all from my property. Not a dollar had been reported to the HOA, the IRS, or any regulatory body. She was effectively running a black market business on stolen land while holding a position of public trust. The media coverage was devastating. Headlines read, "Former lawyer turned HOA tyrant arrested for assault, community president caught running a legal business on private land." Her mugshot made the rounds. Gone was the composed figure of authority. Instead, she looked tired, defeated, and years older than her 55. And her attempt at damage control only made things worse. Through her attorney, she claimed the campground was a community service intended to fund neighborhood improvements. But when reporters requested documentation showing how that money had been used, there was none. The funds had simply vanished into Miranda's personal accounts. The fallout was fast and total. Between mounting legal fees for multiple criminal charges, damages from civil lawsuits, and the cost of restoring my land, Miranda's finances imploded. The house she'd used to secure loans hit the market within a week, priced for a desperate sale. But the most satisfying piece of her downfall was watching her social standing disintegrate. The woman who once ruled through fear and manipulation suddenly found herself completely isolated. Former allies distanced themselves overnight. She was quietly removed from board rosters. Invitations to community events stopped arriving. In a matter of days, she went from feared authority figure to cautionary tally, a living example of what happens when unchecked power runs amok. Dylan, meanwhile, was being recognized far beyond our neighborhood. He was invited to speak at regional forums on HOA reform and grassroots governance. His message was simple but powerful. If someone in power refuses to show documentation, they're probably hiding something. Never be afraid to ask questions, especially if the person you're questioning gets angry. Restoring my property took weeks. My mother's garden, once full of life, had been scarred by tire tracks and garbage, but with each day of cleanup, there was healing. Dylan volunteered his afternoons to help, and together we rebuilt the space, digging, clearing, planting, while reflecting on what it means to stand up to bullies and demand transparency from those who claim authority. The most symbolic moment came when we cleaned out what had once been Miranda's makeshift HOA facade, just a folding table and a cash box set up near a cluster of tents. Among the abandoned junk, we found a wooden nameplate, President Walsh. It was snapped cleanly in two. Neither of us said a word. We didn't have to. That broken nameplate said everything. Miranda Walsh had lost everything: her power, her reputation, her wealth, and, most of all, the respect of the very community she once controlled. From manipulator to outcast, her fall was as complete as it was inevitable. Miranda Walsh was completely shunned, her reputation beyond repair. But what lesson does her story leave behind for those who once believed power could shield them from consequences? Justice was served. But does that truly heal the damage done? 6 months later, I'm sitting by the lake on a crisp autumn evening. The sun dips below the horizon, casting gold and crimson reflections across the water, and I can't help but marvel at how drastically my life has changed since that shocking Friday when I discovered my land had been stolen. The camping area has been fully restored to its natural beauty. My mother's garden, once trampled and buried under trash, now flourishes with fresh blooms and new life. The peace I once sought here has returned, stronger than before. But more than that, this ordeal taught me something vital. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply giving people enough space to reveal who they really are. The transformation within our community has been just as profound. In a special election marked by record turnout, a new HOA board was chosen, one that values transparency, accountability, and fairness. Every transaction is documented. Every decision is made with proper notice and community input. And no single person holds unchecked power anymore. Dylan Pierce, once just a quiet college student asking uncomfortable questions, was elected the youngest board member in the HOA's history. His first motion was a policy requiring full documentation for any HOA action impacting private property. It passed unanimously. As for Miranda Walsh, her legal consequences were swift and far-reaching. She pled guilty to multiple charges: assault, fraud, theft, and misuse of community funds. Her sentence included substantial fines, community service, and a permanent ban from ever holding any position of authority in a homeowners association again. The civil suit forced full restitution for the damage she caused, covering lost rental income, property restoration, and legal fees. But the most significant consequence may be the public record of her conviction. No more hiding behind titles or fake credentials. Her days of manipulating communities are over. Meanwhile, Dylan has grown into a confident, inspiring community leader. He now speaks at regional forums on HOA reform, delivering a message that continues to resonate. Ordinary people have the right to question authority. Always ask for documentation, especially from anyone who claims power over your home, your life, or your property. The Johnson family, who now live in Miranda's former home, have been a breath of fresh air. Their children play in the yard without fear of citations. They host neighborhood cookouts that bring people together instead of driving them apart. Where Miranda once had her HOA command post, the Johnsons built a small community garden, an emblem of growth, collaboration, and healing. Last weekend, Dylan brought his nephew to visit and showed him how to properly set up a camping tent with permission, on appropriate land. and following environmental guidelines. Watching that little boy learn respect for nature and property rights from someone who had defended those principles with courage felt like the most fitting conclusion to this entire saga. The lake house, too, has become something more. The damages Miranda caused led to improvements I'd long put off. The insurance settlement helped me renovate the property in a way that honors my parents' legacy while creating a place for future memories. Ironically, her attempts to exploit my land ended up protecting and enhancing it. Thomas and Susan Hollanta, once too afraid to host a family BCA, have become surrogate grandparents to me. They've shared stories about how the neighborhood used to be and how it fell under Miranda's shadow. Their relief at finally living freely, without fear of arbitrary fines or harassment, has been a powerful reminder of how communities can heal. Sometimes, justice comes not with vengeance but with patience. Miranda Walsh thought she could bury the truth under intimidation, but truth has a way of surfacing and bullies eventually run out of places to hide. This story isn't just about reclaiming stolen property. It's about standing up for what's right, about exposing lies, about the quiet power of everyday people who refuse to be silenced. The biggest lesson I've taken from this experience: ordinary citizens have far more power than they realize when they ask the right questions and demand honest answers. Dylan's persistence, Thomas and Susan's testimony, and the courage of the community to demand change all helped uncover a corruption that had been hiding in plain sight. As the last light fades over the water, I realize this place has become everything I once hoped it would be: a sanctuary for healing, a space for family, and a symbol of what can happen when people choose truth over fear. Miranda believed she could hold on to power through control and deceit, but she underestimated the strength that comes from simple honesty and the courage to ask, "Can I see the documentation?" In the end, the real victory wasn't just getting my land back. It was watching an entire community break free from the grip of a bully. If this story spoke to you, consider liking and sharing it. These real-life justice stories deserve to be heard by those who need them most. If you'd like to support more content like this, there's a donation link in the description. Every bit helps. Thanks for being part of this journey. Join me next time as we explore another incredible story of truth, courage, and justice served. We don't make this stuff up. Real people are justice. Stay tuned, and don't forget to hit the bell so you don't miss what's next.